April 26, 1933. A nondescript office building on Prinz Albrechtstrasse in Berlin becomes operational. Inside, men in civilian clothes begin compiling lists. Names, addresses, associations, suspected loyalties. Within weeks, thousands disappear into basement cells. No warrants, no trials, no records. This was the birth of the Geheime Staatspolizei, the secret state police, the Gestapo. You know the SS. You've heard of the concentration camps. But the apparatus that identified the victims, that knocked on doors at midnight, that extracted confessions in windowless rooms, that machinery remains less understood. The Gestapo was not merely an enforcement arm of the Nazi state. It was the central nervous system of totalitarian control, the mechanism that transformed a modern European nation into a surveillance state where neighbors informed on neighbors, where a careless word meant death, where the boundary between law and terror dissolved entirely. At its height, the Gestapo employed roughly 32,000 personnel to control a population of 80 million Germans and eventually subjugated millions more across occupied Europe. How did so few create such paralyzing fear? The answer lies not in numbers, but in methods. A calculated system of informants, arbitrary detention, and the certainty that resistance meant not just your death, but the destruction of everyone you loved. This organization would compile the deportation lists for the Holocaust. It would participate in the Night of the Long Knives. It would crush every resistance movement from Norway to Greece. And it would do so while maintaining the veneer of legitimate police work, complete with stamps, signatures, and official letterhead on orders for execution. Tonight, we trace the complete history of the Gestapo, from a Prussian political police unit to a continental security empire that reached into every corner of occupied Europe. This is the story of how ordinary policemen became architects of genocide, and how a modern state weaponized fear itself. The Gestapo did not emerge from nowhere. Its roots lie in the turbulent years following Germany's defeat in World War I, when political violence threatened to tear the young Weimar Republic apart. In the winter of 1918, Germany faced revolutionary upheaval. Communist uprisings in Berlin and Munich, right-wing paramilitary organizations, assassination campaigns, the new democratic government struggled to maintain order. Each German state maintained its own political police department, tasked with monitoring extremist groups. In Prussia, the largest German state, this was Department WWII of the Berlin Police, a small unit tracking communists and radical nationalists alike. A career civil servant with dueling scars on his face and a reputation for ruthless efficiency, Diels had spent the 1920s monitoring political extremists for the Prussian government. He cultivated networks of informants, maintained files on suspected subversives, and mastered the bureaucratic machinery of surveillance. When the Nazi Party began its rise to power, Diels watched carefully. He knew how to survive political transitions. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Within days, the Nazi consolidation of power began. Hermann Göring, Hitler's deputy and now Minister-President of Prussia, moved quickly to seize control of the Prussian police apparatus. On April 26, 1933, Göring signed the order creating the Geheime Staatspolizei, the secret state police. The name was soon abbreviated to Gestapo, a contraction that would become synonymous with terror. Göring appointed Rudolf Diels as the Gestapo's first chief. It was a calculated choice. Diels was not a Nazi ideologue, but a professional policeman who understood surveillance, intelligence gathering, and political suppression. The early Gestapo was small, perhaps a few hundred officers operating from the seized Prussian political police headquarters. But Göring gave Diels extraordinary powers. Gestapo officers could arrest anyone without warrant, hold them indefinitely without charge, and operate outside judicial review. This doctrine, called Schutzhaft or protective custody, became a core tool for detention beyond normal judicial protections, resting on the wider emergency legal framework established after the Reichstag fire. The Gestapo's first targets were communists. In the wake of the Reichstag fire on February 27, 1933, a blaze that Hitler immediately blamed on communist conspirators, the Gestapo arrested thousands. Lists prepared during the Weimar years now became arrest warrants. Trade union leaders, Social Democratic Party members, journalists, intellectuals, anyone identified as potentially hostile to the new regime found Gestapo agents at their door. The arrests followed a pattern: a knock in the early morning hours, plainclothes officers, often polite, sometimes brutal, a quick search of the premises, then transport to holding facilities, converted warehouses, police stations, or the hastily established concentration camps like Dachau, opened in March 1933. The Gestapo did not need evidence of actual crimes. Suspicion was sufficient. A letter from a friend now in exile, membership in the wrong organization, a careless comment overheard by an informant. But Göring's Gestapo was not yet the all-encompassing terror apparatus it would become. It remained a Prussian institution, operating alongside similar political police units in Bavaria and other German states. This fragmentation irritated Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS, who controlled the political police in Bavaria and coveted a nationwide security empire. Himmler understood that true power lay in monopolizing the apparatus of state terror. The struggle between Göring and Himmler for control of Germany's political police would define the Gestapo's transformation. In 1933, as Rudolf Diels consolidated his position in Berlin, neither man had achieved supremacy, but the apparatus was in place. The precedent of arrest without trial was established. The network of informants was growing, and every week brought new names to the files. Meanwhile, ordinary Germans adjusted to the new reality. The Gestapo cultivated uncertainty. You never knew who might be watching, who might report a stray comment. This was deliberate. Terror is most effective when it is unpredictable, when the boundaries of acceptable behavior remain unclear. People began to censor themselves, to watch what they said, even to family members. The Gestapo had fewer than 1,000 officers in 1933. But its power derived not from numbers, but from the fear of potential denunciation. By the end of 1933, the foundation was complete. The legal framework for arbitrary detention existed. The first concentration camps were operational. The files were growing. What remained was to expand this system, to bureaucratize it, and to place it under unified command. That transformation was about to begin, and it would not be Göring who controlled the result. Heinrich Himmler was a patient man, a former chicken farmer with a fastidious attention to detail and an obsession with racial ideology. He had built the SS from Hitler's personal bodyguard into a powerful paramilitary organization. By early 1934, he controlled political police forces in most German states outside Prussia. Göring's Gestapo remained the prize. The opportunity came from an unexpected direction. The brown-shirt stormtroopers who had been instrumental in Hitler's rise was becoming a problem. The SA numbered in the millions, far larger than the German army, and Röhm spoke openly of a second revolution to complete the Nazi transformation of Germany. The army leadership, conservative industrialists, and even Hitler himself grew nervous. The SA was too powerful, too unpredictable, too radical. Himmler and his deputy, Reinhard Heydrich, saw their chance. Through the Gestapo and SD, the SS intelligence service Heydrich commanded, they compiled dossiers suggesting Röhm was planning a coup. The evidence was thin, some of it fabricated, but it served its purpose. Hitler authorized what would become known as the Night of the Long Knives. On June 30th, 1934, SS and police units struck simultaneously across Germany. Röhm was arrested at a lakeside resort. SA leaders were seized from their homes, pulled from their cars, dragged from hotel rooms. Some were shot immediately. Others were transported to police facilities and executed after brief interrogations. The purge expanded beyond the SA. Old political enemies, conservative critics, anyone who had crossed Himmler or Heydrich found themselves on the list. Former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher was murdered in his home along with his wife. Gregor Strasser, once Hitler's rival within the Nazi Party, was shot in a Gestapo cell. The regime announced 77 deaths. Historians typically accept at least 85 confirmed, with estimates often exceeding 100. But the significance transcended the body count. The Gestapo and SS had demonstrated their willingness to kill German citizens, including prominent Nazis, on the mere suspicion of disloyalty. They had operated with complete impunity. And the purge, driven by SS and SD leadership with police participation, vastly enhanced Himmler and Heydrich's power. In April 1934, just before the Night of the Long Knives, Göring had already conceded defeat. He appointed Himmler as inspector of the Gestapo, effectively surrendering control while retaining nominal authority. After the purge demonstrated Himmler's indispensability, even this fiction was abandoned. Hitler formally appointed Himmler as chief of German police, consolidating all German police forces, including the Gestapo, under SS control. Reinhard Heydrich, a former naval officer dismissed from service for impropriety, became chief of the security police and SD. Tall, blonde, an accomplished fencer and violinist, Heydrich possessed a cold intelligence and complete lack of empathy that made him invaluable to Himmler. He would transform the Gestapo from a political police force into a comprehensive surveillance and security state. The reorganization was swift and methodical. The Reich Security Main Office, the RSHA, would be created, with the Gestapo becoming Office 4 under this structure. Heinrich Müller, a Bavarian career policeman nicknamed Gestapo Müller to distinguish him from other Nazi officials with the same surname, became the operational chief. Müller was a meticulous administrator who had investigated communists during the Weimar Republic. His lack of ideological passion was balanced by his bureaucratic efficiency and willingness to execute any order, no matter how brutal. Under Himmler and Heydrich, the Gestapo expanded rapidly. Regional offices opened in every major German city. Department heads specialized, dealing with political opponents, monitoring religious groups and Jews, maintaining card files and administration, overseeing occupied territories and foreign workers, conducting counterintelligence. This bureaucratic division of labor ensured administrative efficiency. You could track a case from denunciation to arrest to interrogation to execution, all documented with Germanic thoroughness. The Gestapo also perfected its informant networks. In every apartment building, every workplace, every social organization, someone was watching. The Gestapo cultivated what it called V-persons, Vertrauenspersonen, or confidence persons. These informants came from all social classes. Some were ideological believers, others were blackmailed, threatened with exposure of some minor transgression unless they cooperated. Still others informed for money, settling personal grudges by reporting neighbors to the authorities. The effect was paralyzing. A woman in Hamburg mentioned to her sister-in-law that she hoped the war would end soon. The sister-in-law, motivated by a family dispute over an inheritance, reported her to the Gestapo. The woman spent 6 months in protective custody. The anecdote spread through whispers. Soon, Germans understood that private thoughts must remain truly private, that trust itself was dangerous. By 1936, the transformation was complete. The Gestapo was no longer Göring's Prussian political police. It was Himmler's empire, with tentacles reaching into every corner of German life. And it had demonstrated its willingness to kill not just communists or criminals, but anyone, Nazi or otherwise, who threatened the regime. As 1936 ended, few Germans understood where this apparatus would lead. The concentration camps held thousands, not yet the millions to come. The persecution of Jews was severe, but not yet genocidal. The occupied territories did not yet exist, but the system was ready. The Gestapo had the authority, the personnel, the methods, and the will to enforce any policy Hitler might decree. What remained was for those policies to become truly monstrous. The Gestapo's power rested on a simple equation: uncertainty multiplied by denunciation equals terror. By 1937, this system had reached maturity within Germany's borders. Now it would be tested against specific target populations with increasing brutality. The persecution of Jews had been Nazi policy from the beginning, but in the late 1930s it intensified dramatically. The Gestapo played the central role. Adolf Eichmann rose to prominence in 1938 through his work with Jewish forced emigration offices, particularly Vienna's Central Office for Jewish Emigration. He would later lead RSHA, Referat 4B4, the desk coordinating deportations across Europe. Eichmann was an Austrian Nazi who had carefully studied Jewish culture and Zionism, making himself the SS's supposed expert on the Jewish question. In 1938, the Gestapo began compiling comprehensive lists of Jewish residents across Germany. Names, addresses, property holdings, business interests, everything documented with administrative precision. These lists would prove invaluable in the months and years to come. When new regulations required Jews to register their assets, Gestapo officers verified compliance. When laws forced Jewish businesses to close, the Gestapo ensured enforcement. The apparatus of discrimination required detailed surveillance, and the Gestapo provided it. On November 9, 1938, this persecution exploded into violence. Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, saw coordinated attacks on Jewish synagogues, businesses, and homes across Germany and Austria. The SS and SA provided the muscle, but the security apparatus supplied the organization. Lists of Jewish-owned properties were distributed to local units. Specific targets were identified in advance. And, crucially, authorities were instructed to let synagogues burn while protecting adjacent Aryan property, allowing destruction to proceed according to plan. The official pretext was the assassination of a German diplomat in Paris by a young Polish Jew. The reality was a carefully orchestrated pogrom. Over 2 nights, at least 91 Jews were murdered, with many more dying in the aftermath from abuse, detention, and suicide. Hundreds of synagogues were destroyed, and approximately 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and transported to concentration camps. The Gestapo handled the arrests with characteristic efficiency, working from the lists they had compiled. Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen filled with Jewish prisoners, many of whom were released weeks later after signing over their property and promising to emigrate. But emigration was a trap. The Gestapo controlled the exit visa process. Eichmann's system in Vienna forced Jews to navigate a bureaucratic maze, paying fees and bribes at each stage, surrendering their wealth to the state before finally receiving permission to leave. Thousands complied, fleeing to whatever countries would accept them. The Gestapo stripped them of everything before they left. Religious groups also faced increasing pressure. The Gestapo monitored the Catholic Church closely, investigating priests suspected of criticizing the regime. In 1937, after Pope Pius XI issued the encyclical Mit brennender Sorge, criticizing Nazi ideology, the Gestapo launched a coordinated campaign against Catholic clergy. Priests were arrested on fabricated charges, usually currency violations or sexual impropriety. Monasteries were searched. Youth organizations were banned. The message was clear. The church could maintain religious services, but political neutrality was mandatory. Jehovah's Witnesses faced even harsher treatment. Their refusal to give the Hitler salute or serve in the military marked them as enemies of the state. The Gestapo arrested thousands, sending many to concentration camps where they wore purple triangles to identify their status. Unlike some prisoner groups, Jehovah's Witnesses could secure release simply by signing a statement renouncing their faith. Most refused. The Gestapo found their principled resistance both incomprehensible and infuriating. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and the Gestapo's role transformed dramatically. Task forces of the security police and SD, Einsatzgruppen, followed the Wehrmacht into Polish territory. Their mission was to eliminate resistance before it could organize. Teachers, priests, civil servants, intellectuals, anyone capable of leading Polish resistance was targeted. In operations like Intelligence Action and AB Action, these units worked from lists compiled before the invasion, identifying and executing tens of thousands of Poles in the war's first months. The Gestapo also began implementing anti-Jewish measures in occupied Poland with unprecedented harshness. Jewish populations were registered, marked with identifying badges, and concentrated in designated areas of cities. The ghettos, sealed Jewish quarters in Warsaw, Lodz, Krakow, and elsewhere, were established and controlled by the Gestapo, working with civil administration. What would happen inside these ghettos was not yet clear in late 1939, but the system for mass control was rapidly being assembled. Heinrich Müller, the Gestapo chief, proved masterful at coordinating these expanding operations. From his Berlin headquarters, he issued detailed directives to regional offices, standardizing procedures across the Reich. Arrest protocols, interrogation techniques, filing systems, everything was systematized. The Gestapo was becoming not just a secret police force, but an administrative weapon of oppression. By the end of 1939, the Gestapo controlled a security network that stretched from the Rhine to Poland's eastern borders. Its files contained information on millions of people. Its network of informants penetrated every level of German society. Its officers operated with complete impunity, answerable only to Himmler and ultimately to Hitler. The plot failed in minutes, but the machinery was ready for far worse. The question was how far it would go. As German forces swept across Europe between 1940 and 1942, the Gestapo followed. In every occupied capital, the same blueprint unfolded: a desk, a dossier, an informant, and a basement. What had been developed in Germany and tested in Poland was now imposed on a continental scale. The Gestapo established headquarters in major cities across occupied Europe. In Paris, offices at 11 Rue des Saussets and the Avenue Foch area became centers of terror. Victoria Terrasse in Oslo housed the Norwegian Gestapo apparatus. Amsterdam's Sicherheidspolizei complex coordinated operations in the Netherlands. Regional offices spread to smaller cities and towns. The pattern was consistent. First, identify potential resistance leaders. Second, establish informant networks. Third, demonstrate through selective brutality that opposition was futile. In France, the Gestapo worked closely with the Vichy French police, who proved disturbingly cooperative. French officers provided information on communists, Freemasons, and Jews. When the Gestapo began roundups, French police often conducted the arrests themselves. The Vel de Hève roundup in July 1942 saw French officers arrest 13,152 Jews in Paris, holding them in a sports arena before deportation. The Gestapo provided the lists and the ultimate destination. The French police did the legwork. In the Netherlands, the Gestapo faced a more challenging environment. Dutch civil servants were less cooperative, and resistance networks formed quickly. The Gestapo responded with a combination of infiltration and brutality. Agents posing as resistance members penetrated Dutch networks, identified members, and orchestrated mass arrests. The England spiel, the England game, was perhaps their greatest success. From 1942 to 1944, the Gestapo captured dozens of British-trained Dutch agents as they parachuted into the Netherlands, forcing them to radio false messages to London. The deception allowed the Gestapo to capture arms drops and roll up resistance cells with devastating efficiency. Norway presented different problems. The country's geography, fjords, mountains, isolated communities, made total surveillance difficult. The Gestapo established its feared headquarters at Victoria Terrasse in Oslo, where basement cells held prisoners awaiting interrogation. They recruited Norwegian collaborators, some ideological, others motivated by opportunism or coercion. But Norwegian resistance persisted, and the Gestapo's brutality increased in response. Hostages were executed. Torture became routine. The Grini concentration camp outside Oslo filled with Norwegian prisoners. But the Gestapo's greatest expansion came in the east. Following Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, Gestapo units poured into the occupied Soviet Union. The Einsatzgruppen, task forces of the security police, and SD, including Gestapo, Kripo, SD, and auxiliaries, operated behind the advancing Wehrmacht, but permanent Gestapo offices were established in Kiev, Minsk, Riga, and other major cities. Their mission combined traditional police work with something far darker. In the Soviet territories, the Gestapo implemented Nazi racial ideology with unprecedented brutality. Communist Party officials were hunted down and shot. Soviet POWs suspected of being political commissars were separated and executed, and Jewish populations faced systematic mass murder. The Gestapo coordinated with Einsatzgruppen and local collaborators to identify Jewish communities, organize roundups, and arrange transport to killing sites. In Kiev, at Babi Yar in September 1941, SS and police units with auxiliaries murdered 33,771 Jews in 2 days. The Gestapo had compiled the lists and posted the orders requiring Jews to assemble. Back in the Reich, the Gestapo's domestic mission intensified. The deportation of German and Austrian Jews began in earnest in 1941. Eichmann's department in the RSHA coordinated with local Gestapo offices, civil administrations, and the Reichsbahn to organize transports. Jews received notices to report for resettlement in the East. The Gestapo verified compliance, enforced the strict limitations on luggage and possessions, and managed the assembly points. From there, the transports went to ghettos in Poland and increasingly to newly established extermination camps. The Gestapo also dealt with German civilian morale as the war's reality began to bite. Listening to foreign radio broadcasts became a serious offense. Telling jokes about Hitler or Göring could result in arrest. The Gestapo cultivated informants who reported on neighbors' private conversations. What happens when fear becomes self-sustaining? The answer was visible across Germany. People policed themselves, trusting no one, saying nothing. The Gestapo interrogation centers became synonymous with terror. The basement cells at Prince Albrechtstrasse in Berlin, the converted buildings at Avenue Foch in Paris, the torture chambers at Brindonk Fort in Belgium. These places exist in survivor testimony as voids of human dignity. Interrogation methods varied. Some subjects faced psychological pressure, days of isolation, sleep deprivation, threats against family members. Others encountered direct physical torture. Beatings were standard. Water torture, electric shocks, and worse were documented. The Gestapo sought information, but also sought to break the spirit, to make resistance seem futile. Remarkably, the Gestapo never grew as large as its reputation suggested. In 1942, at the height of German power, the security police numbered roughly 32,000 personnel, controlling a population of over 250 million across occupied Europe. The disproportion was bridged by informant networks and the unpredictability of enforcement. You never knew who might denounce you or when the knock on the door might come. This uncertainty generated a fear disproportionate to actual surveillance capacity. By late 1942, the Gestapo had become part of the administrative apparatus of genocide. Eichmann's desk in RSHA 4B4 coordinated with local Gestapo offices, civil administrations, and the Reichsbahn to schedule the trains to Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec. When problems arose, insufficient rolling stock, overcrowded camps, resistance from local authorities, the bureaucratic weapon solved them. This was not random violence, but systematized killing on an industrial scale. As 1942 ended, the Continental security web stood at the apex of its power. It controlled an empire spanning from the Atlantic to deep inside the Soviet Union. Its files contained millions of names. Its officers operated with absolute authority. But the war was about to turn, and the Gestapo would soon face challenges from an unexpected direction, resistance movements that refused to be broken, and a Wehrmacht that was beginning to falter. By 1943, cracks appeared in the Gestapo's facade of omnipotence. Across occupied Europe, resistance movements were learning the Gestapo's methods and developing countermeasures. The hunters were being hunted. In France, the various resistance networks began to consolidate under the umbrella of the Conseil National de la Résistance. Jean Moulin, a former prefect, coordinated the unification effort until the Gestapo captured him in June 1943. His arrest, the result of a tip from an informant, demonstrated the Gestapo's continued effectiveness. Moulin died from torture without revealing information about the resistance network. But his capture did not destroy the movement. New leaders emerged. The networks adapted. The Gestapo's greatest challenge was that successful resistance required only small numbers, while effective surveillance required enormous resources. A handful of people could sabotage a railway line, assassinate a collaborator, or hide Allied airmen. The Gestapo needed informants everywhere to prevent such actions. As the war turned against Germany, informants became harder to recruit and maintain. Collaboration looked less attractive when liberation seemed possible. In Poland, the Home Army, Armia Krajowa, conducted an increasingly sophisticated campaign against the occupation. The Gestapo responded with mass reprisals. When resistance members killed German officers, the Gestapo executed hundreds of civilians. In some cases, entire villages were destroyed. But the reprisals generated more resistance rather than suppressing it. The Gestapo was learning that terror alone could not maintain control when the occupied population lost hope of German victory. The Gestapo also faced an unexpected threat from within Germany itself. On July 20, 1944, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg placed a bomb in Hitler's conference room at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. The bomb exploded, but Hitler survived. The plot failed in minutes. The purge lasted months. Heinrich Müller personally coordinated the investigation. Gestapo teams fanned out across Germany, arresting anyone with even tangential connections to the conspirators. The initial arrests numbered in the hundreds. Interrogations followed, using every method the Gestapo had perfected. Some subjects talked, others held out. The Gestapo didn't care. They arrested associates of associates, casting an ever-widening net. The purge consumed much of the German military and civilian elite. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Afrika Korps commander, was implicated through confessions obtained under torture. Given the choice between a show trial and suicide, Rommel chose poison. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of military intelligence, was arrested and eventually executed. Generals, colonels, diplomats, civil servants, thousands were arrested in the aftermath. The core conspirators, approximately 200 individuals, were executed after trials before the People's Court, but the broader crackdown claimed thousands more lives. The Gestapo filmed some of the executions. Men hung from meat hooks, slowly strangled with piano wire. Hitler watched the footage. The message to any potential resistance was clear, but the July 20th plot revealed a disturbing truth. Even within Germany, even within the military and state apparatus, opposition to Hitler existed. The Gestapo could not arrest everyone without destroying the very state it sought to protect. Meanwhile, the deportation machinery continued. Even as Germany faced defeat on multiple fronts, the Gestapo prioritized the murder of Europe's Jews. In Hungary in 1944, after German forces occupied their erstwhile ally, Adolf Eichmann personally oversaw the deportation of over 400,000 Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz in a matter of months. The Gestapo coordinated with Hungarian authorities, organized the transports, and ensured the systematic emptying of Jewish communities. This occurred while the Red Army advanced from the east and Allied forces liberated France. The genocide continued even as the Reich crumbled. In occupied territories, the Gestapo's methods grew more desperate. In France after D-Day, security forces conducted scorched earth operations against resistant strongholds. The massacre at Oradour-sur-Glane in June 1944 saw Waffen-SS units from the 2nd Panzer Division Das Reich murder 642 civilians, including women and children, in reprisal for resistance activity. Such actions were part of the wider reprisal climate and security logic that governed occupied territories. Instead of suppressing resistance, the brutality guaranteed that collaboration became impossible and that liberation would be welcomed unreservedly. The paper empire was shrinking rapidly by late 1944. Paris was liberated in August. Brussels followed in September. In the east, the Red Army swept across Poland and into the Balkans. Gestapo officers fled westward ahead of Soviet forces, destroying files and evidence of their activities. Some disappeared into the chaos. Others retreated to the shrinking Reich, where they awaited final orders. Reinhard Heydrich, the architect of the Gestapo's expansion, was already dead, assassinated by Czech resistance fighters in Prague in May 1942. His successor as chief of the security police and SD, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, continued operations, but the machinery was failing. Communication networks broke down. Regional offices lost contact with Berlin. Officers began thinking about survival rather than victory. As 1944 ended, the Gestapo faced the reality of impending defeat. The system that had controlled a continent was collapsing. Files were being burned, witnesses were being eliminated. The officers who had enforced Hitler's will began to understand that they might face judgment for their actions. Some prepared escape routes, others planned to fight to the end. A few began contemplating what they might say when the questions finally came. January 1945. The Red Army crossed into German territory. American and British forces pressed from the west. The Reich was dying, and the Gestapo officers who had dispensed terror across Europe now faced their own reckoning. In Berlin, Heinrich Müller maintained the routine of bureaucratic terror even as the Soviet artillery grew closer. The Gestapo headquarters on Prince Albrecht Strasse continued operations into April 1945. Prisoners were still interrogated. Files were still updated. Executions still occurred. The routine cruelty dressed as procedure ran until it physically could not. But across the collapsing Reich, Gestapo officers were making choices. Some fought. In the final battle of Berlin, Gestapo personnel joined the Volkssturm, the People's Militia, and SS units in desperate defense. They understood that surrender to the Soviets meant certain death. In the streets around the Reich Chancellery, men who had ordered the deaths of thousands died themselves, often without anyone knowing their names or crimes. Others fled. Adolf Eichmann, as Soviet forces approached Budapest and later Vienna, escaped westward. He eventually reached Argentina using a rat line, escape network, that smuggled wanted Nazis to South America. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, whose Gestapo unit had tortured and murdered hundreds of French resistance members, also escaped to South America, initially with help from American intelligence services, who valued his anti-communist credentials and knowledge of Soviet intelligence. Heinrich Müller, the Gestapo chief, simply vanished. Last reliably seen in the Führer bunker in late April 1945, his fate remains unknown. No body was ever definitively identified. No post-war sighting was confirmed. He may have died in Berlin's ruins, been killed by the Soviets, or escaped. His disappearance epitomizes the chaos of the Reich's final days. In the occupied territories being liberated, Gestapo officers faced summary justice. In France, resistance members who captured Gestapo agents often executed them on the spot. In Poland, where the Gestapo had operated with particular brutality, even those who surrendered to Allied forces were sometimes handed over to Polish authorities and received death sentences. The Gestapo had shown no mercy, and little mercy was shown in return. But the majority of Gestapo personnel were not senior figures like Eichmann or Müller. They were career policemen, bureaucrats, file clerks, the system's component parts. Many of these men surrendered to Western Allied forces and were processed through prisoner of war camps. Some were identified as Gestapo members through tattoos. Many SS members bore blood-type tattoos under their arms. Others were denounced by fellow prisoners. Still others evaded detection entirely. The question of what to do with these men would occupy Allied authorities for years. War crimes trials were planned even before the war ended, but the security apparatus had employed thousands across Europe. Prosecuting them all was impossible. Priority went to senior leaders and those with direct involvement in mass murder. The evidence was abundant. As Allied forces liberated concentration camps and occupied Gestapo facilities, they discovered vast archives. The Gestapo's compulsive documentation of its crimes provided prosecutors with detailed records. Deportation orders signed by Gestapo officers, interrogation reports, execution lists. The paper engine of genocide was laid bare. In the Reich Security Main Office files, investigators found the evidence of systematic planning. Memos discussing the final solution with the detached language of administrative efficiency. Schedules for deportation trains. Reports on Einsatzgruppen operations in the Soviet Union, complete with body counts. The Gestapo had created the evidence of its own crimes. The major Nuremberg trials began in November 1945. The Gestapo, along with the SD, was declared a criminal organization, meaning that membership in specific categories could constitute evidence of war crimes. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Heydrich's successor as chief of the security police and SD, stood trial. He claimed ignorance of the Holocaust, a defense that collapsed under the weight of documented evidence. He was convicted and hanged in October 1946. But Kaltenbrunner was one man. The trials of individual Gestapo officers continued for years. In the subsequent Nuremberg proceedings and in trials conducted by individual Allied nations, hundreds of Gestapo members faced justice. Some received death sentences. Others received prison terms. Many were convicted in absentia, having escaped or died. The Einsatzgruppen trials in 1947 to 1948 focused on the mobile killing units that had operated in the Soviet Union. 24 defendants faced charges of mass murder. Evidence included their own meticulous reports, daily tallies of Jews killed, methods used, locations of mass graves. 14 received death sentences, though only 4 were ultimately executed. In France, trials of Gestapo officers who had operated in Paris, Lyon, and other cities proceeded through the late 1940s. Klaus Barbie was convicted in absentia in 1952, though he would not actually face French justice until his extradition from Bolivia in 1983. Other officers received varying sentences depending on the evidence against them, but many escaped justice entirely. The chaos of post-war Germany, the development of the Cold War, and the sheer number of potential defendants meant that most Gestapo officers were never prosecuted. Some entered Allied intelligence services, their knowledge of Soviet operations valued more than punishment for their crimes. Others simply resumed civilian lives, their Gestapo service concealed or minimized. As the Iron Curtain descended, West German authorities became reluctant to pursue war crimes prosecutions vigorously, fearing it would undermine the new state's legitimacy. East Germany conducted trials, but often for propaganda purposes. The result was that thousands of men who had served the security apparatus lived out their lives without facing consequences. The few who were captured decades later became symbols of delayed justice. Adolf Eichmann's capture by Mossad agents in Argentina in 1960 and subsequent trial in Jerusalem demonstrated that accountability, though delayed, remained possible. His execution in 1962 closed one chapter, but it also highlighted how many chapters remained unfinished. The Gestapo's collapse in 1945 was total, but its legacy endured. The organization had demonstrated how a modern state could weaponize bureaucracy in the service of totalitarian control. It had shown how ordinary men could commit extraordinary crimes when insulated by hierarchy and ideology. And it had proven that evil need not be dramatic. It could be systematic, documented, and stamped with official seals. The Gestapo existed for 12 years. In that time, it evolved from a small Prussian political police unit into a continental security web that stretched across Europe. What began as an instrument for suppressing political opposition became the administrative apparatus of genocide. Understanding how this happened requires examining not just the organization, but the society that allowed it to function. The Gestapo never operated in isolation. It required collaboration. French police who conducted roundups, Dutch civil servants who maintained registration records, Ukrainian auxiliaries who guarded ghettos, and countless private citizens who informed on neighbors. The organization's power derived not from its numbers, but from the willingness of ordinary people to participate in or passively accept its operations. This collaboration stemmed from various motivations. Some collaborators believed in Nazi ideology. Others were motivated by careerism, seeing opportunity in the new order. Still others were coerced through blackmail or threats, and many simply went along, convincing themselves that they had no choice or that their individual actions didn't matter. The Gestapo understood these motivations and exploited them systematically. The informant networks were perhaps the Gestapo's most insidious achievement. By cultivating uncertainty about who might be watching, the organization transformed private life into a potential minefield. People censored their own thoughts and limited their trust even within families. This internal policing was more effective than any number of Gestapo officers could have been. The legal framework that enabled the Gestapo, protective custody, detention without trial, operation outside judicial review, demonstrates how quickly liberal legal protections can erode. The Weimar Republic was a democracy with a constitution and an independent judiciary. Within months of Hitler's appointment as chancellor, those protections were systematically dismantled. The lesson is that legal safeguards require constant vigilance and cannot be taken for granted. The Gestapo's bureaucratic nature also demands attention. This was not random violence, but systematized oppression. Policies were written down, procedures were standardized, and outcomes were measured. The deportation of millions to death camps required railway timetables, staffing schedules, and coordination across multiple agencies. The Holocaust succeeded because it was administered efficiently. The banality of this evil, to use Hannah Arendt's formulation, remains chilling. After the war, West Germany confronted this legacy incompletely. The Adenauer government prioritized reconstruction and reintegration over extensive purges. Many former Gestapo officers resumed careers in police forces, civil service, and private enterprise. The Federal Republic's Intelligence Service, the BND, employed numerous former Gestapo and SD personnel. The justification was always the same. Expertise was needed, and focusing too much on the past would prevent moving forward. This approach had consequences. In 1963, a Jewish survivor of the Lion Gestapo walked into a government office in Stuttgart to apply for a permit. Behind the desk sat the clerk who had processed her deportation papers 20 years earlier. He recognized her. She recognized him. He looked down at his forms and continued working. She left without the permit. The moment passed without consequence. This scene, repeated in variations across post-war Germany, illustrated how incomplete denazification had been. The trials that did occur, Nuremberg, the Einsatzgruppen proceedings, the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials in the 1960s, established important precedents. They documented crimes comprehensively, established individual accountability, and rejected defenses based on following orders. But they prosecuted only a fraction of the perpetrators. Heinrich Müller was never tried. Thousands of Gestapo officers lived out their lives in freedom. Justice was partial at best. The question that haunts any examination of the Gestapo is how it could happen. How could educated, cultured Germany, a society that produced Goethe and Beethoven, create such an apparatus? The answer is that culture is no protection against totalitarianism. The Gestapo drew its officers from the same society that valued art and philosophy. Reinhard Heydrich was an accomplished violinist. This did not make him less ruthless. The Gestapo's methods have been studied by subsequent totalitarian regimes. The East German Stasi explicitly modeled aspects of its operations on Gestapo techniques. The informant networks, the detailed files, the cultivation of fear through unpredictability, these were lessons learned from the Nazi security apparatus. The fact that a communist regime adopted methods from fascist predecessors demonstrates that the nature of totalitarian control transcends ideology. For survivors and victims' families, the Gestapo remains a living wound. Many who were interrogated in Gestapo cells never fully recovered psychologically. Those who lost family members to deportations, organized by Gestapo officers, carry that loss across generations. The trauma does not fade with time. The physical remnants of the Gestapo's empire are scattered across Europe. The Gestapo headquarters on Prince Albrechtstrasse is now the Topography of Terror Museum. Interrogation centers in Paris, Oslo, and Amsterdam have become sites of memory. Concentration camps where Gestapo prisoners died are preserved as memorials. These places serve as reminders, tangible evidence of what happened, and warnings against allowing it to happen again. In the end, the Gestapo's history is not merely about an organization. It is about the fragility of civilization, the ease with which legal protections can be dismantled, and the willingness of ordinary people to participate in evil when given permission and cover. It is about how bureaucracy can systematize murder and how ideology can justify the unjustifiable. The Gestapo existed because millions of Germans and occupied Europeans either supported it, collaborated with it, or failed to resist it. The officers who tortured prisoners in basement cells, the bureaucrats who scheduled deportation trains, the informants who denounced neighbors, they were not monsters from outside human experience. They were people operating within a system that made cruelty normal and resistance costly. Understanding this is essential. The lesson of the Gestapo is not that it represented some unique German evil, but rather that the conditions that allowed it to flourish, authoritarian government, surveillance of citizens, elimination of legal protections, scapegoating of minorities, cultivation of fear can emerge in any society. The specifics change, the underlying dynamics remain. From a small office on Prince Albrechtstrasse to a security empire spanning a continent, the Gestapo's rise and fall traces the arc of Nazi Germany itself. What began in April 1933 as Göring's political police ended in the rubble of Berlin in May 1945. 12 years. In that time, the organization arrested millions, deported millions more, and created a surveillance state whose methods would be studied and replicated by totalitarian regimes for decades to come. The Gestapo was declared a criminal organization at Nuremberg, but that judgment came too late for its victims. The families destroyed in the Warsaw Ghetto, the resistance fighters tortured to death in Paris, the Jews deported to Auschwitz, the political prisoners who vanished into night and fog. They received no justice from legal declarations. Some perpetrators were punished, many were not. The Gestapo's true legacy is not in its organizational chart or its arrest statistics. It lies in what it revealed about human nature and political systems. It showed how quickly democratic institutions can collapse when challenged by determined authoritarians. It demonstrated how ordinary people can be enlisted in extraordinary crimes through a combination of ideology, fear, and opportunity. And it proved that evil need not be passionate. It can be bureaucratic, methodical, and documented in triplicate. The men who staffed the Gestapo were not aberrations. They were products of their society, operating within a system that rewarded cruelty and punished compassion. Some were ideological believers. Others were careerists seeking advancement. Many were simply doing their jobs, following orders, maintaining files. The fact that genocide could be administered like any other government program remains the Gestapo's most disturbing lesson. Today, the Gestapo headquarters is a museum. The cells where prisoners were tortured are preserved as memorials. The files that documented millions of lives are archived for historians. But the organization's impact extends far beyond museums and archives. Every surveillance state, every secret police force, every regime that detains citizens without trial, all operate in the shadow of the Gestapo precedent. The victims deserve remembrance, the crimes demand documentation, and the lessons must be learned. The Gestapo succeeded because the society allowed it to. Understanding how that happened, how fear was weaponized, how law was perverted, how neighbors became informants, remains essential. Not as historical curiosity, but as warning. The knock on the door at midnight, the arrest without warrant, the disappearance into detention. These did not end with the Gestapo's collapse in 1945. They continue wherever governments operate above the law and citizens have no protection from state power. The specifics change. The underlying threat remains. The Gestapo's history is a study in what humans are capable of when restraints are removed and cruelty is systematized. It is a reminder that civilization is fragile, that legal protections are essential, and that silence in the face of injustice enables evil. These lessons, purchased at the cost of millions of lives, must not be forgotten. If this story moved you, challenged you, or helped you see the Second World War differently, it would be an honor to have you join our growing community. Subscribing isn't just a click. It's a way to support more powerful stories, more forgotten voices, and more truth from the past. So if you believe these stories matter, hit that subscribe button and let's keep building this journey together. And don't forget to leave a comment. We read everyone and love hearing your thoughts. Until next time, keep exploring history with Epic War. Keep asking questions. Keep seeking the truth. Keep seeking the truth. Keep seeking the truth. Keep seeking the truth. Keep seeking the truth.